Are you happy with this idea that we start off with sort of the political relevance of literary studies, or I mean, how would you like to launch in?
Yeah, I'm happy with it. I mean, it's interpreted in so many different ways. I think that a lot of people think that politics, obtains in literature simply because there are political contents in literature.
Mm-hmm.
So a protest novel, or a novel that exposes, let's say, the chicanery of the US government, like in Don DeLillo or something like that, is the first thing that comes to people's minds when they talk about the politics of literature.
Mm.
And then there's the problem, really, that in a certain school of literary theory, I would call this a kind of left Derridian thinking, that doing theory in graduate, student seminars is immediately political, that this is the way that politics expresses itself today. Right? So it's the idea kind of like not mudding yourself, dirtying yourself with involvement in an activist politics is a good thing. It's like learning from the past, learning what went wrong in the past politically. And that instead to try to think the unthought, right? To kind of break the mold of older ways of thinking.
So this is sort of political radicalism, but within a very neatly defined, quite elite circle.
I would say certainly elite, but there's an enormous amount of self-delusion and unreflective mentalism, that's involved in this gesture. But it does have, kind of a political foundation in the mind of those who practice it. So to me, when it comes to literature and politics, we juxtapose those two things. I think that I prefer to think of it differently. I'd like to, there's of course more than one option here, but the more fruitful way, it seems to me, to think about it, and it's also a way that doesn't negate what is essential and special about the study of literary form, right? Would be to think in terms of the historical study of genre, or the way that a certain kind of literary form is itself political. Well, how, for example? Well, in the work that I've been involved in for the last couple of years, it's going back and kind of a literary history and also intellectual history of anti-colonial thought. I've gone back to the work of Giambattista Vico. And Vico is very interesting because he was a rhetorician, a Latin rhetorician, rather humble, never had a very good academic job, but he tried to study the prehistory of human civilizations, that is, before there were written records,
right,
by going back into antiquity and seeing how people had frequently misread those little bits and shards of what had survived in the written record of a later period. And he developed a theory of poetic reading where you could, he argued, see that the very first peoples, the peoples who created the first cities, who established religion for the first time, the institution of marriage, a lot of the things that are very essential, like the construction of the wheel, the invention of the wheel, when it comes to civic questions, when it comes to the establishment of polities, for the very first time, that these people had a largely poetic imagination, that they thought in terms of mythology, that mythology itself was a form of scientific inquiry. This is an idea that's later picked up in Dialectic of Enlightenment by Adorno and Horkheimer, more famously. And that kind of places them within a kind of Vickian tradition, which is part of what I'm trying to trace.
Yeah, sure.
So, this notion that there's a deep link between poetic imagination and the invention of the first cities, the first laws, and sort of a sense of civic justice.
Yeah.
Now that's an interesting connection between politics and literature. Because I think that, in the current moment in the United States, certainly, I think it's true also in England, there's an all-out assault on the humanities, partly because of the relationship that the humanities have to the word, to to interpretation,
Yeah.
to the notion that there's meaning that is latent.
So are you suggesting an argument whereby literature gives us a sort of a mind map for understanding our world, which is in itself political? To have a sort of a political understanding of things, we have a poetic imagination, or we get our underlying ideas, our underlying concepts from literature?
Well, I think it's related to literature. It's more a question of the relationship to the word, to the hermeneutic sense, right? The project of interpreting meaning is itself under assault, okay? And it's under assault within the humanities by way of a scientific trend within the humanities, the feeling on the part of people in the humanities that they have to defend what it is they do by coming over in some way to the claims of the natural sciences. So we see this in any number of ways, in a number of different movements theoretically within the humanities: distant reading, surface reading, thing theory, anti-philosophy. It takes many different forms. So many of the things that unite these disparate schools is the notion that we should no longer be obsessed with meaning. That it's more about the aesthetic sensitivity and immediacy of experience in the presence of the artistic object. Words become physical. They're something that just sort of flow over us. We're not supposed to get hung up on meaning. So this is sufficiently and kind of dramatically upping the ante from things that have been argued over the last 10 or 20 years, which of course were all about the semantic plenitude of the text, right? This was to say that meaning is important but also irrecuperable, that there's always going to be more meanings than can ever be pinned down. Or the notion that the reader or interpreter is actually making the meaning rather than, deciphering it. So in all of these ways, what's under attack is the notion of the critical sensibility approaching the difficulty of the text, whatever that text might be, and providing an interpretation such that it's understood that there are better and worse interpretations, more or less dutiful, scientific, knowledgeable interpretations. And to me, that's a very, very dangerous territory to enter. It's highly relevant and suspicious even that so many different schools find their way to this directive. So the politics of literature here becomes, yes, okay, the study of literature does attune one to the question of the plenitude of meaning, but also the recuperability of meaning in the presence of a critical intelligence that's been trained to understand the kind of polyphonic, prismatic intelligence that one finds in a text, right? And that it requires a certain skill and labor to elicit that information. That more I would call that a philological notion of meaning is, in my view, desperately important to hold on to and to recognize as being under attack.
So can I interject and suggest, so you've been saying this is the politics of literature, but in a way what it's sounding like is it's the politics of literary theorists, or the politics of why we need people to have that knowledge and interpret literature and then make it accessible to a broader audience.
No, I don't think so. I think that literary theorists have an important place, and I would not back away from that. So I think. So
then, who is doing the mediating? I suppose is my question.
I think that everybody who reads a text is doing that mediating. I think that everybody who reads novels on the subway is doing that.
Okay.
The women and men who attend book clubs and moot the questions of the day via what they're reading in literature are doing that. The way that people who perhaps aren't very knowledgeable, have never gone to graduate school, affix themselves to the sensibility of one author versus another and emulate what that world of emotion and thought that is there in that author to them. I mean, all of that matters a great deal. I'm saying, though, that the politics of literature is probably not a conceptual point that everyday readers are going to argue about in the terms that we're discussing.
It would be nice to bring in some reflection on authorship, and translation seems to be one way of doing that, and perhaps bridging the discussion about sort of philological study of writers and literary philosophy, or philosophy that has come from literature. So you know, how do authors fit into all of this? How are they grounded within that system that you've set out?
Right. So I do believe that while theory is important, that it's really what we're missing in theory, as a dimension of theory, is intellectual history. So this is one of the reasons that I've been turning to that sort of thing in this work of mine, especially this recent book, Borrowed Light, which is very much about trying to explain the origins of anti-colonial thought in Europe, and by going back to the 17th century and up through the 18th and 19th century and into the 20th, where it takes its form in Marxist thought in the interwar period, and that this is really kind of a Vickian tradition that I'm laying out there. Okay, that's the idea about that. Now, when it comes to authorship, the thing that's so important about authorship in this precise context is that, I studied with Edward Said, and Said is really, really interested from the beginning of his work, in the book he wrote, called Beginnings, in fact, in exploring not just the etymological but theoretical relationship between authorship and authority.
Yeah.
And to me, the authority of the humanist intellectual is desperately important to hold on to in precisely this period when the humanities are under attack, and when people within the humanities are drawn, because of the pressures of scientism in the general culture, towards the displacement of the fully constituted, willing subject. Okay? So to get back to the politics of literature, what's really at stake in the notion of authorship from the point of view of the politics of literature is this question of authority. Yeah. On the one hand, it's a deep kind of philosophical problem that is what's really being called into question when one calls into question authorship as authority is the subject who wills, who consciously follows influences, who emulates certain traditions and not others, who helps create, in other words, a way of thinking and being that one tries to persuade others to. Yeah. The whole question of authorial intention is obviously bound up in that. Yeah. So that's kind of the deep philosophical, but there's a less exalted or deep or philosophical way of understanding this question of authority, and that has to do with, is everybody's opinion equal? Right? I mean, is it a good thing or a bad thing for intellectuals to assume responsibility for what they do without conceding that their opinion is just one among many? Isn't it, in other words, important to hold on to the idea that the hard work that intellectuals do, reading the record, plowing through the archives, synthesizing their knowledge, calling it into question, interrogating it by placing it under the withering glance of their colleagues and contemporaries, that all of that process, doesn't that lead to something? The authority of the humanist intellectual is a very, very important thing to hold on to, because it seems to me that people, like Said, but not only, Noam Chomsky and Pierre Bourdieu in France, they can play such an important public role as being a sort of general sensibility, widely read, able to understand the philosophical origins and issues, and yet able to write in an accessible style that puts ideas into play, that creates new agendas.
So this is authorship at a meta level, right?
Yes.
I wonder if we could come at the question from a slightly different angle, and just keeping out there this idea of a system, whether it's a world system or manifesting at more local level. The sort of, we live and work in a generally capitalist system, right, in the Western world. And you mentioned untranslatability earlier, which I take it you were referring to Emily Apter's work on Against World Literature, where she comes.
I wasn't really. I mean, she's coming along and saying something that many people have said before her. I don't find her work very distinctive in that respect. But yes, I think it's an important issue that she's confronting along with others. I mean,
okay, so I'll just finish the question, as it were. So this idea of untranslatability, I mean, Apter does talk about specifically the role of the translator as sort of working within this system, and she's looking for, is there any way of standing outside of this essentially capitalist literary system? And she suggests that, she calls it the translational author. I'm not entirely sure what she means by that, but you know, she looks at the translator who is taking an author from one context to another, that this may be some way of subverting ideas of authority and ownership which go with, you know, the idea that an author has a text. The text is the copyright of that author. It fits into a certain national context, and translators challenge that. Because of course they take the text out of the context, they put it into a different language, and there are questions about to what extent the translator has changed the text and in that sense co-authored the text. And I just wondered whether in your thoughts you've dealt particularly with the question of language and translation and how that would fit into these kinds of systems that you've been outlining.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, that's a great question. I have been involved in translation, and so I've thought about some of these things, and I think that I'm reluctant, very much so, in fact, to think at all of the translator as the co-author of a work. I think that so much stress is placed on, you know, the traducement, you know, of the original by the translator, the inability to capture the completion of the original, all that line of thinking, and often this is mobilized, or these arguments are mobilized as an argument against translation and the need, the kind of Heideggerian imperative to read only in the original language, that only the person who is a native of that language can truly understand what's being said, and these kinds of ideas. These are ideas that I reject. My experience tells me are profoundly untrue. I work in several foreign languages, and I don't really feel that there's a fundamental difference between what I'm understanding from the text that I'm reading in the original from that of a native speaker, nor do I feel actually with the great translators who are out there right now that we are reading something fundamentally different when we're reading it in translation. I mean, I'm having for this very gathering that you've pulled together here, I'm having some of the participants read a novel written in Dutch. By somebody who spent a lot of their time in Java in the 19th century, and so was working very often in the language of Malay. So there's Malay, there's the Dutch, and we're reading it in English, and in this particular novel there's lots of different styles that he's involved in. And so you wonder as you're reading this, like, is this translator accurately capturing the shift from one style to another in English, even though it was really written in Dutch? And you think to yourself, on my experience, because I have read some things that pose the same kinds of problems in the original after reading them in English translation, my answer would be yes. I think we're getting a very good sense that it's not fundamentally different. There will be some differences, but not much. But here's the point I was going to get up to, and that is in regard to translation, which is, it seems to me that the traducement line of inquiry overlooks the fact that an act of translation, precisely because it will not be the same as the original, is a kind of homage to the original. That is, it focuses our attention on the difference. It makes us think of the priority and primacy of the original. The author, as the author, looms larger in the presence of the translator. That's my actual experience when I read a translation. And I do believe that it has a great deal to do with the thinking of the translator, him or herself, when they're involved in it.
I mean, would that actually be an argument for saying that the exact opposite of what Apter was putting forward, and that actually translators reinforce images of the author and the context that he or she comes from?
That's exactly my point. And that's one of the problems I have with her work, but I also think there's a kind of latent, sort sort of Derridian notion of the text and untranslatability, and it's posed, and I think sincerely posed, as a problem of capitalism and the market and Eurocentrism.
Yeah.
And wanting to avoid that, and I'm all for wanting to avoid that.
Yeah.
But no, I know, in answer to her question, as you phrased it, I don't think there's an Archimedean point outside of the capitalist market.
Yeah.
That does not mean that everybody, by virtue of having to put their money in banks and invest in the stock market for your retirement, is a capitalist.
Yeah.
I don't think that either. I think that it's not the case that everything that one utters under capitalism is subsumable into the system in that appropriative way that capitalism does. There are things that are unsayables. There are positions which do, in fact, affect the system negatively, and that it wants desperately for people not to say or think. And our duty as intellectuals is to locate those, and to say them, and to maintain our authority as an antinomian presence that can think outside the present, that can think of an alternative present. It's the negative, in the good sense of negative, it's the negative capacity of criticism that we need to have.